Kia ora koutou. Thank you so much for coming today at this afternoon hour near the end of the year where we're all just ready for a break. So grateful for everyone coming together. And it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sophie Curtis-Ham today. Sophie has a PhD from the University of Waikato in psychology, and I was lucky enough to be in the lab with her when she completed that under the supervision of Devon Plaszczyk and Oleg Medvedev. And she is now working as a senior researcher at New Zealand Police and is also an honorary research associate for Te Puna Haumaru, this institute at the University of Waikato. Sophie was formerly a crime and intelligence analyst in the UK and in New Zealand, and her research interests span evidence-based policing, crime science, environmental criminology, and investigative psychology. That's a mouthful. With specialist areas including geospatial crime analysis, behavioural and geographic profiling, and the measurement of crime harm. So really an expert and the perfect person to talk on the topic we have today, which is where do people commit crime relative to their other activities, and what does this mean for crime investigation and prevention? So I'm going to hand over to you now, Sophie, and feel free to put questions in the chat and we'll do a bit of Q&A at the end of Sophie's presentation.
Cool, thanks April. And thanks for having me along to this series. I've really enjoyed what I've attended so far of the seminars put on by Te Puna Haumaru, which I'm proud to be affiliated with in addition to my role at New Zealand Police. So kia ora tātou, welcome everyone. Nō te whanganui o Tāraho, ko Curtis te whanau, ko Ham te whanau, ko Sophie tōku ingoa, tēnā koutou katoa. So I'm based here in Wellington at the Evidence-Based Policing Centre, where I've been continuing on some of the research from my PhD that April mentioned. And the focus of that is really around where people commit crime. Within that, I'm particularly interested in where they commit crime relative to where they do other activities, not just crime, and what that can help us with when it comes to preventing and investigating crime. So that's what I'm going to be talking through, what we kind of know on these topics currently. So I'm going to talk fairly broadly about where crime occurs and then hone in on this relationship between crime and offenders' activity locations, and then talk through some of the practical applications. And there's a few teasers there to get you thinking about what these practical applications might be in terms of who done it, where's the body even, and where will people offend next. So disclaimer, don't send any press or media the Minority Report saying that's there as a joke. We're not there yet and likely never will be. Okay, so where does crime occur? Crime occurs where people decide to commit crime. So this is going to be all about decision making. It's important to recognise that crime occurs as part of this decision making process, whether that's conscious or unconscious, planned or spontaneous. So what do we know about the criminal decision making process when it comes to where to commit crime? First, offenders weigh risk, effort and reward in this decision where to commit crime. So that's in terms of the particular efforts or security to overcome, how far to travel to commit the crime, what are the rewards involved, is it a potentially high value crime or high reward depending on the motivation of the offender. These things are being weighed up, but they're not necessarily weighed up in a really rational way, just the same way that when we are making non-criminal related decisions, we're acting as suboptimal decision makers, contrary to the sort of optimal model in economics. We are constrained by what we know and different weights that we might attach to different factors that we're weighing up. So it's not to say that crime and the location of crime is a really rational, well thought out, optimal decision making process, but it does involve this kind of weighing up. And that process of weighing up is related to what you know about. So you can only really weigh up what you know and how certain you are of those things to do with the different locations that you might be deciding between. And that whole constraint around what offenders are aware of is really at the crux of what I'm going to be talking about. So second, we need to know about what kind of situation is likely to provide that kind of balance of risk, effort and reward. What situation provides a good crime opportunity? And it's routine activity theory or the routine activity approach that gives us a framework for thinking about this. So there are three core elements or ingredients in this framework. We have a motivated offender, that's someone with the intent to commit a crime. Kind of take that as given. There's a suitable or attractive target. It could be a person or property, like a premises in the case of burglary or a ram raid. And then that target needs to be available, so not protected by anyone or anything guarding the target that could intervene to stop the crime. And that's considering the effort and the risk involved. And when those elements, those three core ingredients come together at the same location, same time, crime can occur. It kind of requires all those three components. And then pulling this together, there's two approaches in terms of the decision-making process and the kind of ingredients that make a good opportunity for crime to occur. We have crime pattern theory or the geometry of crime from the Brantinghams in the early 90s, and that tells us that this convergence of suitable unguarded targets, good crime opportunities, and motivated offenders, where do they converge? Where are they likely to come together in space and time so that crime can occur? And the answer to that is that this convergence happens where offenders go about their routine, including non-criminal activities, where that overlaps with the opportunities, which can be dictated by the distribution of suitable targets. So thinking about a good place to rob or a person to offend against, very much dictated by where those things are distributed and where they move around. And you can only commit a crime against them if you know that opportunity exists. So people's knowledge of where opportunities exist is dictated largely, but not exclusively, by their everyday activities. So think for a moment about your own routine activities. Chances are your mental map, or what we call awareness space, that's the places you're aware of or familiar with, is pretty patchy. You're not intimately familiar with the whole of the city in which you live, say. And that mental map is constrained to the places you maybe sleep, where you work, where you study, socialise, shop, and so on. All these activities that make up your daily life. Or it could be that you have an awareness of the places you used to live or frequent. And that remains in your memory, remains in your mental map, although it might degrade over time. And you also are familiar with the routes between these places, your well-beaten paths. We call these places activity locations or activity nodes. I'm going to use that language interchangeably. So if you were to decide where to carry out a future activity, say where to move, where to go for dinner, where to shop, your decision would be informed by the opportunities you're aware of within your mental map. You might also go to other sources like ask friends or look at Google Maps, that sort of thing, but you're still often using the knowledge you already have of where a good opportunity is. And it's exactly the same with crime. And one thing to note is that these aren't just theories that I'm talking about. They're not just ideas. Many decades of empirical research, both qualitative and quantitative, backs them up. Lots of evidence for these theories, especially confirming that people are generally more likely to commit crime near to their activity locations and the places they know about than further away, venturing further afield or into the unknown. Okay, so that's sort of the where crime occurs, and I want to drill down now more into this relationship between offenders' specific activity locations and their crime locations. So crime occurs where these activity locations generate awareness of the crime opportunities, but it turns out that not all activity locations are equal in the decision-making process. So think about the scenario that's very roughly diagrammed on the slide there. In principle, based on the theories that I've just talked through, people could commit crime wherever any of their activity nodes or the paths between them intersect with crime opportunities. I'm going to call that grey area of crime opportunities the opportunity zone. But are all those equal? I already hinted that they're not. So in this scenario, we might want to know, is person A more likely to commit crime in that opportunity zone where they live? So there's a little house there for person A. Or is person B, who grew up in the area, went to school there, and was recently pulled over by police for speeding in the area, that's the little siren icon, are they more likely to take advantage of the opportunities in that area if we're sort of equally motivated, say, all other things equal with person A? What knowledge have those different activity locations afforded person A and person B? And this isn't just an esoteric question. Understanding how individual offenders' different activity locations impact their crime locations is important, because that's what enables us to make specific predictions about where individuals are most likely to offend, not just where crime occurs in the aggregate. And again, think back to those practical applications that I kind of teased earlier, and we'll get onto those. So when I started looking into this question of what are the differences between these different activity nodes that might help us to start making some specific predictions, there was an emerging empirical literature on this topic. So people were more likely to commit crime near some activity nodes than others. But there wasn't any kind of overarching theory that explained which nodes people were more likely to commit crime near and why that would be. So I made one up, or more precisely, I created this theoretical framework that actually draws on a really wide range of literature on crime, on human mobility, on location choices in general, since they follow the same sort of decision-making process as crime location choices, and teased out these specific attributes of people's activity locations that the empirical evidence told us had a relationship with them committing crime in a location. So I'll unpack this a bit. And those attributes, that's the top level in the diagram, they kind of fell into two separate categories or pathways, more around the quantity and quality as kind of labels for those. I'll talk about them a bit more. So broadly, what this schematic is saying is that for any future activity, we're more likely to choose somewhere that we have both reliable and relevant knowledge of. So that's knowledge that is relevant to that particular activity, in this case, a particular kind of crime. So looking down the reliability pathway, how often, how recently, or for how long we've been visiting a location affects how familiar we become with that location and how reliable our knowledge of it is. So, for example, we typically visit our homes every day and over a long period of time. So we get to know the surrounding area really well, really familiar with it, high reliable knowledge of that location. Down the other pathway, how similar our activities are at that location to a future activity affects whether we acquire knowledge of it that's relevant to the opportunities it affords for that activity. So, for example, with a criminal activity, committing a crime somewhere gives an offender very relevant knowledge of that location's opportunities for that kind of crime. We know from empirical research that there's a strong relationship between committing a crime somewhere and committing that same crime in a nearby location. So it's really telling you you've had success with that crime, might as well just go back to the same location. Similarly, there's a strong relationship in terms of time of day or week. If you've been to that location, even for a non-criminal purpose, at a given time of day, then you're more likely to commit a crime there at the same kind of time of day or day of week than at a different time of day of week or time of day, for example. And that applies to our regular activities, like you get to know the affordances that a place has for a given activity based on the timing of that activity. So passing by a shop at night time doesn't provide much information about what you could buy in that shop or what you could shoplift in that shop. And the last item down that kind of pathway is around the type of location. So you're more likely to gain relevant knowledge of opportunities, say, for a commercial robbery through activity at commercial rather than residential activity locations. Now, this is not a comprehensive theory, I don't think, by any means, but it at least gives us a framework to work with, a place to start when we're trying to make those predictions about which of their activity locations a given individual is more likely to offend now. So I want to talk through a couple of studies that I did to provide some further support for that theory and to kind of illustrate the methods used in that research paradigm and some insight into the kind of data that was used as well. So the first study was looking at quite broad types of activity location. And thanks to the New Zealand Police who provided this information, and it was extracted from the National Intelligence Application, which is called NIA, which is really kind of a goldmine. I realised when I was previously to my PhD working for police that there was a lot of information about all these disparate activity locations that police have reason within their day-to-day duties to be taking down this information. So we had more than just sort of people's home locations to look at. So the offence data I was using covered about 60,000 offenders in total who'd committed any one of those crimes in a 10-year period between 2009 and 2018. And I was looking at the latest offence of each of those types that they had committed and took a random sample of half of those for the research that I'm going to talk through. And by committed, I mean that police had enough evidence to prosecute whether they then prosecuted or not, which is a common standard for offending data in this kind of research. And these are the different kinds of activity locations I discovered in the data. Interestingly enough, when I've been applying some of this in practice more recently, I keep finding additional sources of data, but I can't really go back in time and update this now. So in this research, I was looking at offenders' address histories, so current and previous addresses they'd been recorded as having. The previous addresses and current addresses of family members, so that could be parents, children, siblings, current or former intimate partners, so spousal relationships, or more informal relationships, and other relatives. I also had places that are non-crime incidents, as well as crime occurrences, where the person was either the offender of that crime, so that's the prior crimes bucket, and where they were a victim or witness of a kind of crime. And very rarely, but occasionally, we have reason to note down where someone goes to school or went to school and where they work. That's pretty rare, but with this kind of research, you take what you can get. And those other police interactions are things like places people were arrested at, places they've been noted as frequenting, or seen at, that sort of thing. In this data, most offenders had at least 10 activity nodes, but there was quite a wide range. Okay, I'll skim through the statsy stuff, but just to note, the research method that I was using for this is called discrete spatial choice modelling. It kind of as laid out there, models the choice that the offender is making between different possible places to commit crime, and gives us a value of how much more likely they are to choose a location with a given attribute, say being 400 metres from where they lived previously, or they had committed an offence previously in that exact location. And by location here, I'm talking about neighbourhoods. And what we find when we run that analysis with broad types of activity location, like those different types that I mentioned, is that generally for each type of activity node, having a node of that type in that neighbourhood meant they were more likely to commit crime in that neighbourhood than elsewhere, with only a few exceptions dependent on crime type, which highlights that people commit crime near pretty much any of their activity locations. It's not just where they live, which makes sense really, because if you think about that example of wanting to find somewhere to go or somewhere to go shopping, it's not necessarily going to be right where you live. And out of the different types of node, the most likely to commit crime near to home or prior crime neighbourhoods. And that's in line with the theoretical model, because, as I mentioned, home is a really high reliability activity location. We are really familiar with the area around our homes. And prior crime nodes tend to be high relevance, because it gives you that really relevant knowledge of what opportunities there are for that kind of crime or any kind of crime. Another finding was really backing up what lots and lots of research has found previously. We found a distance decay pattern, which means that people are less likely to commit crime in a neighbourhood the further away it was from an activity node. And thinking about those specific activity location attributes in the theoretical model, people were more likely to commit crime near to nodes that they would visit more frequently than less frequently. Like we see when we compare people's own homes with their family members' homes, which obviously they frequent less frequently. And for most crime types, they were also more likely to commit crime near to closer family members than homes of intimate partners or other relatives, which again speaks to that kind of frequency or places they'd be more familiar with over a longer period of time. They were also more likely to commit crime in places where they had committed crime before, than in places they had experienced crime as a victim or witness, which speaks to that sort of behavioural similarity attribute in the theoretical model. And lastly, they were more likely to commit crime in a residential burglary near to a residential type of location like their home, than commit a non-residential burglary or robbery near home as a residential location. So that's consistent with the concept of location type similarity being important in this decision-making process. And the second study I'll just briefly mention looked at the same data but from a bit of a different perspective, considering reliability and relevance as those two separate pathways. So we had to do a fair amount of data manipulation and coding to come up with indices that represented reliability and relevance, combining all those top level attributes. But through combining them into an index of reliability with nodes that were high frequency, high duration, high recency, and combining the attributes of similarity into an overall kind of similarity or relevance index, so places with the same location type, similar behaviour, and similar timing. We're interested in looking at whether the kind of interaction that's posed in that theoretical model, where you're more likely to commit crime near to the ones that are high on both those factors or indices, than places where you might have quite reliable knowledge, but you haven't really done similar things there in the past and gained that more relevant knowledge, and so on down to least likely to commit crime, somewhere that you have fairly unreliable knowledge and it's not really relevant to the crime. And so when we were constructing those variables, just a limitation to note, it was quite challenging to work out the timing of some of these things, having to sort of assign average values like, okay, well, let's just say we visit home daily. I found a survey which said that typically in New Zealand, people visit family members once every 2 weeks. So frequency for that kind of got 2 weeks, and that sort of thing. So there were some generalizations that needed to be made, and that impacts on the reliability of the results. So I do need to caveat that. But what we did find was consistent with what we'd expect from the model. So people were more likely to commit crime where their prior activity locations indicated they'd have both reliable and relevant knowledge. So high there on the slide. So that's places they'd be highly familiar with and had conducted similar activities in the past. And crime was less likely where they had less familiarity and had conducted less similar activities in the past, and least with the low lows. So albeit there were some limitations with the data, it still provided some support for the theoretical model, and altogether this kind of highlights the importance of including all these different variables when you're modelling or predicting offenders' crime locations. Like, each of those were quite important attributes to include. So that's important for our practical applications and how it all applies in the real world. I just want to point to some kind of research horizons and next steps to potentially extend this research if anyone's looking for research ideas. I think it would be quite good to extend the empirical evidence base for the model using other data, other methods. There's all sorts you can do now with time use surveys, GPS data, interviews, that sort of thing, to unpack that decision making more. Ran out of time for all of this in the PhD, obviously. And in terms of theory, like I said, it's incomplete. I think there's ways that could be expanded, such as looking at which of these, that top line of factors, matter more, whether you've been there more recently, or really is it frequency that's driving reliability, things like that. What other factors affect the development of reliable and relevant knowledge, things like individual differences, and what dimensions of behavioural similarity matter, because I really just looked at the type of crime someone had committed before, whereas obviously you can measure behavioural similarity many different ways. And in terms of the practical research horizons, that's where I'm kind of drilling into at the moment. So given that we need to account for these differences between activity locations, we're making predictions about where individuals will offend. We also need to test whether those predictions, when you're applying them in the real world, pan out, and whether they can be useful in those practical settings, which is what I'm going to talk through in the last part of this seminar. Okay, so the first application is in whodunit cases, which are a bit like a game of Guess Who that hopefully everyone remembers from childhood, and it was one that I quite liked playing. But in this case, it's more likely that we're shuffling the board so that the most likely suspects in the case come to the front of the board, and those are the people that we kind of focus on when we're devising our questions to Guess Who, and in a police investigation, those are the people that they take a closer look at in terms of evidence gathering activities. So in whodunit kind of cases, we can use police data on suspects' activity locations, like the data that I talked through just before. We can use that to work out who is most likely to have committed a crime, given the location of that crime, based on how close it is to their personal activity locations and what kind of activity locations they are, given we know that all activity locations are not equal in this decision-making process. And what I did in my PhD was I built an algorithm that automates this prediction process. It maps all the suspects' activity locations in police records and then ranks the suspects for a given crime. And it goes by the name of GP-SMART. That's the Geographic Profiling, Suspect Mapping and Ranking Technique. I tested GP-SMART on thousands of solved cases, and that suggested that the algorithm was accurate enough, i.e. putting the actual offender at or near the top of the suspect list, enough to support trialling it in practice, which is what I'm doing at the moment on live investigations. And I've got to say, it's been pretty satisfying using it. I'm going to talk through how it works, and also to note that it is just it's a process, and it's, although I've been using it implemented in R, it's something you could implement as sort of a thinking or more manual process, not necessarily as an algorithm. So following this kind of method would get you to a pretty similar outcome, which you'd be able to do manually if you had a few suspects that you were prioritizing between, for example. But the benefit of having the computer do it, it means you can process many thousands of suspects if you have a list that long in a matter of seconds, which obviously would take a very long time if we were to do it manually. So here is how that process works. We've got all those different types of activity locations for our list of suspects, and we measure the distance between those locations and the input crime. We then move the suspects with no activity locations within a set distance of the input crime to the back of the board. We flip them down at that point, metaphorically, they're out. And in the data that I used testing this process, 10 kilometres was a good cutoff that still put the actual offender within 10 kilometres almost every time. Depending on the type of the crime, it was about 86 to 96% of the time. We then predict how likely each of the remaining suspects is to have committed the crime based purely on the distance. Remember, I was talking about awareness space, and the further away somewhere is from an offender's activity locations, the less likely that is to be part of the offender's awareness space simply because of the distance. So they're less likely to commit crime there further away. We then adjust the predictions so that the activity locations that people are more likely to have committed crime near have higher values than the less likely activity locations. So, for example, a recently visited activity location would have a higher value. We'd weight that one upwards than a less recently visited activity location, the same distance from the crime. And there's a weighting value for each of those attributes, the top line in the theoretical model, to use to adjust the predictions. And what was quite confirming for me was that when I was testing the algorithm on these thousands of solved cases where we knew who the actual offender was, weighting the activity locations, not just using distance, but making these adjustments because we know that they're not all equal in the decision-making process. That weighting meant that the process was more accurate. It put the actual offender higher up the list. That's a horrendous slide, and it's just the maths of it, but it does kind of highlight that there's not actually that much maths going into this. It's not an AI, it's not a black box algorithm, it's a glorified Excel formula, and even better, it's Bayesian. So for anyone interested in that further, there's a paper I can refer you to, and the code is on GitHub. And the last step is to identify for each suspect the activity location that yields the highest probability of them committing the crime. And then we simply rank the list by that probability. And of course, in a real life investigation, as I'm finding now putting this into practice, you have other intelligence and evidence that helps narrow the list even further, or kind of grouping the board even into priorities, or adjusting those priorities based on, say, someone's criminal history. What I'm finding at the moment with the casework that I'm doing is that I've got the geographic prioritization on one side, and then also often some indications from what used to be called the profiling squad in police, the behavioural science unit, and they'll say, okay, prioritize people with X, Y, or Z in their criminal history, as they're more likely to have done this kind of behaviour, and I can use that to adjust those priorities accordingly. And that's what it looks like if you do go fossick around on GitHub and download the R package. There's a wee widget there where you can visualize and explore the results, that sort of thing. Okay, so I want to talk a bit more about where that algorithm or process fits in the wider process of what's called geographic profiling. Because it's geographic profiling that we're piloting at the moment, it's not just the running of an algorithm. We can't just leave it all up to the machines. So GP Smart is very much a tool in the toolbox of geographic profiling, which is a collection of analytical methods used by trained geographic profiling analysts who interpret the results within the context of the case and provide investigative advice accordingly. So it's just to show how it all works in practice, with the key point being that the algorithm bits, which are outlined in red there, there's a few different software that you can use, different complementary methods, of which GP Smart is one. That's just one point in the process of going from inputs through to outputs and interpreting them. And when we're evaluating this pilot, we'll be looking at that whole process in terms of whether it does actually assist in investigations. It's unlikely to actually solve a crime because it doesn't generate evidence, but it can help to prioritise investigative resource. So if you've got a long list of suspects, then you need somewhere to start. You're not necessarily going to have the resource to look at everyone. So that is the first kind of use case around the where done it to who done it, I guess, is the question there when you're prioritising suspects. And something that has come up in the context of piloting these methods is that sometimes the question that the investigation wants answered is not necessarily who done it. They have a strong idea of who done it, but these are homicide cases where the body has not actually yet been found. And we can use, again, this knowledge about where people are likely to commit crime relative to their activity locations to help the investigation hone in on the potential locations where a body might have been disposed of, be it buried or otherwise disposed of. So I've started using that activity location data for this purpose. It's very early days, I would say, but the way that it's operating at the moment is that we're applying that same kind of logic of mapping out their activity locations and saying which ones are they more likely to commit crime near, and then overlaying that with what we know about potential body disposal opportunities, thinking about the risks, the effort, and the reward involved, the reward being getting away with it, and the risk really being around, like, you don't want to risk driving around or traveling far with a body. So distance is quite a big factor. And also how private or accessible or under your control a given location would be. So to illustrate, this is an example where I've mapped out suspect activity locations, colour-coded by the type of activity location, and the size of the dots is how recent those are, whether they're kind of current awareness based or previous places that people have been associated to. Obviously, I can't talk about case details. These are live investigations, so I'm not going to show the base map with street layout or to give you any sense of scale or land use information that, of course, in the real life investigation are using to provide important context to those dots. So the high frequency nodes such as home addresses, those big red dots, especially current home addresses, are particularly salient to look at a bit further, and the more recent activity locations, the ones that we focus on as well. It's a bit more of a manual process than the kind of algorithmic situation that I talked through with GP Smart. And the analysis looks at both specific addresses among those activity locations and the areas around them that could provide opportunities for body disposal, thinking about like I said, the risk of detection and the effort involved. And I've actually found that even just the process of showing this, visualizing it on a map and talking through it with the investigators, with the OC, the officer in charge of a given investigation, can help flag up locations of interest for them to take a look into. So though it's kind of early days with this pilot, you can start to see where it can help to generate, I wouldn't even probably go so far as to say leads, but it's at least places to look into and see what they already know about those locations. And the last application I wanted to highlight is around this kind of minority report scenario of predicting where someone will offend in the future to inform more sort of prevention activities. And this is where we have a known offender or strong suspect, and we need to identify where they're likely to offend or re-offend. And like I said, huge disclaimer, it's not actually a minority report scenario in reality. Neither our theories nor algorithms are enough for exact predictions, still very much probabilistic, but hopefully that gives a feel for the kind of use case that we've got here. And there's two different kind of settings where I think this applies. So we can look at what we know about a person's activity locations and see where their awareness space overlaps with potential targets. And that's quite relevant in offender management and community corrections settings. And we've probably got some people who are more in the corrections domain here than investigation and policing, so something to think about there. It could take part of a risk assessment and management process, working out where an individual's high risk kind of triggering places are for reoffending, to help them to put in strategies to either avoid those locations, or if they're unavoidable, how they might otherwise be aware of and mitigate that risk. And back more in my wheelhouse, this thinking is also relevant to serial crime investigations, where you have a strong suspect and you want to hone in on where they might offend next to help to target, say, security advice to potential victims, for example. So this slide is a mock-up. It's not a real case, but just to illustrate, the symbols I've got there are different types of retail outlets. And I did have ram raids in mind, but I could not find a specific layer for dairies. But by way of example, in this case, we've got someone's activity locations mapped out, and I've just highlighted there what I would prioritise in terms of the places they might, the retail outlets they might be more likely to commit crime at, which are nearer to those activity locations rather than the ones that are a bit further away. It's not the best illustration what I could throw together. I haven't encountered this particular scenario yet in the pilot. Like I said, it's kind of early days, but it is something that I think could crop up. Okay, there are a few references there I'm happy to share with people if you want to learn more about where people commit crime and what that means for investigations and prevention. And I hope you've enjoyed that whirlwind tour from theory to practice.